The siren didn't belong to us, it belonged to the street, to January, to the kind of cold that makes glass ring and breath look like it's trying to escape the body. My dog's ears tipped forward before my mind caught up, and then the smell arrived, burnt sugar and hot metal, tugging at something so old and certain inside me that my legs were running before. I thought to gather the blanket that served as our roof. We slept beneath the train trestle where the river folded into shadow, a careful geometry of cardboard, tarp, and a milk crate that held the few things worth saving. We didn't have a home, but we had a route, and the route ran past a little bakery with a peeling blue door and a bell that sounded like someone had bottled kindness. On that morning, the bell screamed instead. The front window trembled with heat, and behind it, through a scrim of smoke, an old woman staggered like a small boat in rough water, one hand hallowed by flour, the other groping for a phone that had fallen somewhere into the firelight. "Jax," I said, but my voice was already lost to the sound my boots made on broken glass. My dog leaped first because he didn't understand hesitation, only the shape of need, and I followed his body through the door, as if he were the only compass that had ever told me the truth. I call the first chapter Bread of Winter, because that is what her place was to the street. Warmth you could smell from the corner, the kind of smell that reached into cold pockets and lit them from the inside. The chapter begins with the way hunger becomes a weather and how, in a city where everything moves too fast, the small bakery moved at the sensible pace of yeast. Jax and I were ghosts then, the kind people look through. I walked loops to stay warm and to stay away from the places where my old noise returned. Door slams, metal shouts, the iron taste of vigilance that never rests. The bakery's window told a different story, gold loaves lined in a row like a promise. A woman in a flour, dusted apron whose hair had turned the color of the flour years ago. Her hands were quick, then gentle, like she was apologizing to the dough for everything the world had done to it. I never went in. On some afternoons, she put a paper bag by the door with 2 rolls and a hollow in the top where steam gathered like a prayer. When I looked up, she pretended to scold a bowl or check the oven, because some rituals are only true when unclaimed. This chapter ends with the alarm, the flames making shadows talk on the ceiling, the bell going hoarse, Jax's bark cutting the smoke like a blade, and the old woman calling for someone who wasn't there. The next chapter is Sugar and Sirens. It is the chapter where the city's noise braids itself with our history and pulls us through the window. Inside, heat stands up straight and stares. The air tastes like copper candy and fear. I remember the sound of my boots on the tile, the soft squeal of rubber that meant we were moving toward something hot enough to change us. Jax wove left, low to the ground, like a piece of shadow that had found a purpose. The woman's cough punched the room. She was by the oven, the pilot light misbehaving, a pan of caramel seized into a hard, smoking crown. She was trying to turn a knob that had forgotten how to be kind. When she saw us, she looked embarrassed, as if almost dying were a social error. I wrapped my hands in a towel and killed the gas like I was disarming a memory. Jax leaned his shoulder into the back of her knee until she sat down on the flour sack like he'd suggested the idea himself. We opened windows. We moved trays. We made the smoke learn a new exit. And in the stillness that followed, sirens closer now, neighbors with phones. The winter light trying to get in but bouncing off the heat. She looked at us the way people look at miracles, when the miracle is shaped like 2 bodies, simply doing what had to be done. She asked our names in a voice that sounded like tea. I told her. She said her name was Rosa, and of course it was because she looked exactly like the word tries to look when it grows old and proud. The third chapter is The Hours Between Ovens. It is about the days after, when I tried to go back to not existing and failed. Rosa's door was open again, the bell repaired and sheepish. The blue paint on the frame newly fresh in a square where the scorch had been. She had placed a little table by the window, and on it a bowl of water, and a plate that some days held a heel of bread, other days a slice of cake that looked like a quiet celebration. She invented reasons to talk to Jax. He's handsome, she'd say, and then, to me, and you bring him good places. I told her we stayed places because we were allowed. She shook her head. Allowed is a verb for small people. You live here. I can smell it. Flower sees everything. Slowly, I found myself arriving at 4 in the morning, because she told me the mornings were when the world didn't perform. And if I came then, no one would pretend not to see me. She handed me an apron and pretended surprise when I tied it like I had once tied tourniquets. The dough felt like a living animal beneath my palms. Jax patrolled the warm line between ovens and door, occasionally putting his nose on a fallen crust like a critic. We shaped loaves while the dark peeled itself off the windows. Rosa told me in bits and pieces between needs that her husband had carried this place like a heartbeat until his heart forgot to carry him, that her children had moved to warmer hills, that the bakery was the only stubbornness she couldn't unlearn. I told her less because my history had teeth, but she seemed to listen to what I didn't say, as if silence were a language she understood. The 4th chapter is Rope and Butter. It belongs to a day in late February when the city wore a hard shell of old snow and the river muttered under it, and a scream stitched the block from end to end. Outside, a woman slipped in the crosswalk and couldn't find her legs outside. A bus coughed smoke like it was panicking. Outside, the world crawled to the scene and then stood too far away. Rosa moved first, fast like a memory of youth, and then faltered at the curb because her knees were the kind that count weather. The woman in the crosswalk was small and square, bundled to her chin, her bag of groceries open, oranges rolling like bright planets under tires. The walk signal blinked with an indifferent face. Jax reached the woman first and became a wall beside her. I followed, spun my palm to stop the traffic with a gesture my body remembered even when my brain wished it didn't, and lifted her into my arms as if she had been born to be carried. Her ankles sang a high, broken note, but the rest of her looked intact. We got her to the bakery, put her on the bench that lived under the window, wrapped her in a wool blanket that smelled of clean bread. Rosa pressed a bag of frozen pastry dough against the swelling as if butter could barter with pain. The woman's name was Maeve. She had no one to call and too much pride to say so. We called a clinic anyway. We made tea. We listened to the weather talk about nothing until words stopped shaking. When they took her away, she cried because leaving felt like failure, and Rosa held her hand, and Jax put his chin on the edge of the stretcher like a promise that the world sometimes gets better. Later, under the soft ceiling of night, Rosa sat very still on a flour sack and looked at her hands as if they were a map. "You are not an accident," she said to me, as if that needed correcting. "And he," she said to Jax, "is the angel with fur. The 5th chapter is inheritance. But it isn't the kind people think when they hear the word. It is the kind that starts when someone looks at you and sees not your damage, but the way you love with it." Rosa's breath had been more work lately, and she blamed the ovens because bakers blame what they love. She slept sometimes in a chair when the day refused to end kindly. I would lift her ankle onto a footstool and tuck a towel under it like dressing a wound I could do in my sleep, because sometimes the world is kind enough to give you a skill twice. One rainy morning, when the city dissolved at the edges and the bakery windows wore tears, Rosa placed an envelope on the table like a loaf that needed time. "Open it when you can swallow without crying," she said. I didn't understand then. We worked as usual. We gave a man on the corner the end of the baguette because some ends are the best parts. We watched the steam leave the rolls like small souls. That evening, she grew very quiet in the chair, and the quiet had the terrible shape of an answer. I sat on the floor at her feet and watched her chest rise like a small boat on a gentled sea, and I held her hand because hands are what we hold when language fails. By morning, the chair held only the shape of her, and the bell over the door made a sound I had never heard it make. I opened the envelope with the kind of care usually kept for newborns, and inside was her will, and in it the bakery she had been clutching to her ribs with both arms, given to me with an old woman's practicality and a love that didn't ask for permission. I don't count the chapters in the way books do. They counted themselves, like loaves cooling on a rack. The story afterward folds and rises with air, but it begins with the city feeling suddenly 12 sizes too big and me 15 again and hungry. In the days after Rosa left, grief was a new noise in the room. Jax checked the bakery every morning, nose to the corners, as if looking for the part of her that smelled like bergamot and almonds. People came by with their hands shaped like casseroles and their faces shaped like apology. But some also came with knives sharpened for another task, a son who wanted to know what right a stranger had to inherit his mother's life, a landlord whose smile was a threats rehearsal, a health inspector with a checklist that read like a poem written by someone who had never needed hope with their fingers. I wanted to run, to go back to the river and the anonymity of the trains, to be an ache with fur instead of a man with keys. But the bell over the door imposed order on my fear. It rang. A neighbor stood there with a bag of flour and the kind of courage people borrow from each other. "We don't want the smell of this place to die," she said. "Teach us your hands." She had assumed I knew what I was doing, and because confidence is often a baton passed forward, I nodded and said we would start at dawn. That first morning without Rosa, the dough stuck to the bowl like grief. I spoke to it out loud like a fool, as if I could coax it into resilience by offering my own in trade. Jax lay across the threshold and dreamed about oceans he had never seen, paws twitching as if he were chasing whatever runs just ahead of us all. The neighbors came early, shaking snow out of their hair, and together we learned the difficult choreography of flour, water, salt, and time. My hands remembered the rhythm of compress and fold from the person I had been before I learned to trust nothing. The oven's roar was a comfort instead of a threat. The first louves looked like attempts. The second looked like hope after a night's sleep. I made the coffee too strong and the music too low, and the sun did us the favor of existing. Customers gathered, tentative but ready to be conquerable by crust. A boy pressed his nose to the glass and forgot to be cool. When I slid the first tray out, the steam hit the air with that specific softness that turns a room into a house. I tore a heel and handed it to the boy with the kind of gravity bread deserves. He smiled with his whole body like a curtain thrown open. News troubles travel faster than good ones, but word of a place that smells like survival has legs too. People who had never spoken to us began speaking, and underneath their words lay other words like "I am tired of eating alone," and "Please let me buy coffee for the man behind me," and "The world took a bite that I am still trying to replace." We put a jar on the counter with a small sign that said, "Rosa's Bench," and the money went to anyone who needed to sit down and not explain it. Sometimes it bought a bus pass. Sometimes it bought a night in a shelter that didn't ask too many questions. Sometimes it bought a bag of dog food, because in the stories we like to tell, dogs always eat. But in the stories we live, it's often more compromised. The son who came with anger came back with a different set of eyes. He held his mother's apron like an apology and told me stories about a childhood that smelled like raisins and rain. The landlord fell in love with a woman who worked the counter and forgot to notice us, which is how some miracles arrive. A real climax doesn't announce itself with drums. It arrives dressed like one more exhausting day. In March, a pipe gave up behind the wall with the resigned groan of a soldier laying down his pack. Water whispered at first, then sang, then shouted. By the time we found the lever, the kitchen was a reflective lake where loaves could learn to swim. The health inspector, an earnest man who believed rules were his way of saving people, arrived with his clipboard just as the ceiling remembered gravity. His mouth made the shape of a no. He was doing his job. The oven hissed, offended by the invasion. Jack stood dripping, insulted and muddy. For a moment I saw it all unspool. The paper taped to the door, the chairs stacked, the way silence loves an empty room. The neighbors gathered, and their faces said the same silent word. I realized the only way through was to invite them into the mess. I handed out mops and towels like communion. The inspector held himself rigid, and then Jax put his wet head on the man's thigh with the authority of someone who has been to worse countries and returned, and the man laughed. I almost didn't recognize it as laughter, because I had never heard it from him. He pocketed his pen. He helped us lift a table to drain out the leg. He gave us 2 days to repair the damage and didn't write the citation. It felt like we had inherited. On top of ovens and debt and ache. One more astonishing thing time. We repaired what we could. I sold my jacket with the hot, stitched divisions on the sleeve that once meant something to someone and bought a roll of copper pipe and a day of a plumber's patience. We set up a folding table on the sidewalk and sold coffee and cinnamon knots in paper bags to pay for the rest. Snow kept trying to fall, but mostly just watched us from the edge of the sky. People who had never spoken to each other compared leak stories and laughed like a choreographed choir. A woman wrote a poem on a napkin and hid it behind the sugar, and when I found it a week later the paper was sticky and the words were perfect. By the time we opened the door again, the bakery felt like a chest someone had thumped back into rhythm. I hung a photograph of Rosa behind the counter, not high and holy but near the coffee filters where hands could find it, and on a quiet afternoon. The sun came and traced the outline of her face with a finger that didn't quite touch. He said, "Thank you," in a voice that barely made it out of his throat. I said it back to him because the word had grown larger than a single direction. I could tell you about the day a man in a suit came and tried to sell me something that would make me more efficient, and how I told him I was done with efficiency, if it meant speed without tenderness. I could tell you about the school that asked us to teach their kids to make bread and how a room full of 10-year-olds needing dough can fix parts of the world governments cannot reach. I could tell you about the woman in a green coat who came in every Wednesday and ordered a particular roll and carried it to a small brass plaque in the park and ate it slowly. And the day she finally told me the name on the plaque had once liked only that roll, only on Wednesdays, only when the world was kind. I could tell you about the winter we kept the lights on through a storm, because people needed a place where windows steamed and someone knew their names, and how, after the power went out for the entire block, our oven held its heat like an old friend. I could tell you about the spring we planted herbs in the alley, and the summer we hosted a free table, and the autumn when the river finally gave back a bicycle we thought it had learned to love. When happiness arrived, it did not arrive like a parade. It arrived like someone placing a warm mug into your hand and knowing exactly how you drink it. It arrived like Jack's learning to sleep belly up without jerking awake at the slightest sound. It arrived like me forgetting, for long stretches, to figure the exits in every room. It arrived like the bell over the door making its old music, and a new boy pressing his nose to the glass the way the other boy had, and me thinking how every childhood deserves a smell that becomes its home. One supper we closed early and moved the tables, and the flour dust rose like fine fog in the evening light. We invited anyone who had a story about Rosa and the bakery, and they came with bowls and bottles and ridiculous desserts and sat close enough that their shoulders learned each other. A man with scars down his wrists played a guitar, softly, and a woman with a scar under her eye sang with the kind of voice that makes quiet not a lack but a choice. I stood by the door with Jack's pressed against my leg and watched the room become a cathedral without a god other than whatever we make together when we choose to remain. On the anniversary of the day we ran through the window, we woke at 3 and walked to the river, the trestle still holding up the night the way it always had. The place where we had once slept was clean, because someone had given it a color, and I felt a small pang at the loss of our old geometry, even as relief ran over me like water. We stood there and listened to the traffic hum, and the winter speaking in its dry branch voice. I told Jax we were not at war anymore, and my mouth didn't know where to put that sentence. He leaned into my knee and looked at me the way he had looked the day we jumped. Steady, unsentimental, absolute. When we got back, the bakery was already breathing. Dawn is loud in kitchens. We fed the starter and it rewarded us with its particular song. The street woke one window at a time. The first customer was a man I'd never seen who held the door for an old woman and then looked startled by his own gentleness, like it was a bird that had landed on his arm without asking. If there is a moral, I have learned to distrust it, but still, sometimes a life is a crust you didn't know the interior of until someone breaks it under your hands. Sometimes an old woman holds on long enough to hand you a key that fits not only the blue door, but the lock in your chest. Sometimes the son who thought he was losing learns the way loss and gain are bad at minding their boundaries. Sometimes the health inspector becomes a man who brings his daughter on Saturday mornings and lets her press a thumbprint into the sugar cookies because regulations and love are not enemies. Sometimes the dog who led you through fire teaches you to sit very still in the middle of a room full of noise and find the exact spot where your breath belongs. In the evenings, when the day has lifted its weight and leaned it somewhere safe, I sit at the corner table by the window with Jax's head warming my boot and Rosa's photograph watching us without judgment. The bell rings sometimes even when no one enters, a trick of draught, and I like to think it is her walking in, wiping her hands on her apron, telling me my baguettes are flirting with overproofing. The city outside is complicated and will never stop being so. People will leave their humanity in bags they forget to pick up, storms will find the weak roof, hunger will come and come. But here, in this room she made and I keep, something quiet and relentless rises. I learned that a bakery is not a business, but a way of holding the morning up so people can walk beneath it. I learned that the best recipes are the ones written in hands across time. I learned that the smell of bread at dawn is a country you can live in even if you don't have a passport. When we shut the lights, I leave the one over the counter on, a small moon for anyone who passes and needs to know there is a place that remembers their names. Jax does a final lap, touching nose to chair legs like a sentry taking attendance, and then he returns to my side and sighs the long sigh of a creature that's done enough for one day. The ovens cool with a soft ticking gratitude. The river goes on making its polite arguments with the banks. And somewhere between the train's far horn and the neon across the street deciding to sleep, I press my palm against the warm blue of the door and whisper the only prayer I know that never learned how to ask for anything more than this: may the hungry find us. May the lonely sit, may the tired be given soft chairs, may we always have enough to cut one slice thicker than we should. On some nights, if the wind is right and the bell is practicing its magic, I swear I hear Rosa's laughter arrive on the sound of the latch. A dry, warm crackle like crust when it breaks, and I answer out loud so the room doesn't have to "we're here." We will keep the fire. We will keep the bread. We will keep each other. The days after Rosa's passing folded over me like damp parchment, heavy, creased, and full of words I couldn't read yet. The bakery still breathed. The yeast didn't care about grief. It kept rising as if defying death itself. I kept hearing her voice through the hiss of the ovens, through the creak of the old floorboards, gentle, amused, endlessly patient. Don't overwork the dough, soldier. It only needs warmth, not force. Jax lingered at her chair by the window for days, his head tilted like he was waiting for instructions that would never come. Some nights I'd catch him whimpering softly, nose pressed against the apron she used to wear, and my throat would tighten with that strange grief that has no direction. It just fills every available space. When I finally opened the bakery again, the bell above the door hesitated, almost shy. The regulars came in quietly at first, leaving coins on the counter and stories on their tongues. She used to give me bread on credit when my husband was sick. She let my daughter knead the dough so she wouldn't skip school. She never judged the hungry. I wrote their stories down on napkins, not knowing why. Maybe because I needed proof that goodness could be documented. The old woman's son came one evening, his suit still smelling of the city. Expensive, impatient. His eyes scanned the shop as if measuring loss by square footage. He saw me behind the counter and stiffened. "So it's true," he said. "She left it to you." His voice wasn't cruel, just confused, the way a man sounds when the world rewrites him without permission. I nodded, unable to offer an apology that would matter. He looked around again, slower this time. His gaze landed on Rosa's photograph behind the counter, her flour-dusted smile immortalized in soft sepia light. His jaw loosened. "She always said this place would outlive her," he whispered. I guess she was right. He left without another word. But the next morning, a delivery truck arrived with fresh sacks of flour and a note taped to the side, "For Rosa's soldier and his dog. Keep her ovens warm." It snowed that night, thick and steady. The street glowed under lamplight like a quiet confession. I sat on the stool near the ovens, hands buried in dough, letting the heat climb through my sleeves. The rhythm of kneading became a heartbeat. The bakery's, mine, maybe hers. Grief slowly changed its texture. It stopped cutting and began to hold shape. By spring, the city thawed into colors again. The regulars started bringing friends. Word spread about the veteran's bakery with the loyal dog. I pretended not to notice when people left tips that looked more like offerings. Folded bills tucked under coffee cups. Envelopes slipped beneath plates. One afternoon, a young reporter showed up, notebook trembling in his hands. "They say you saved her," he began. "And she saved you." I smiled because both were true. "We saved each other," I said. Jax became something of a local legend. Children left him scraps of croissant and called him the hero dog. He took it all in stride, tail wagging, eyes half closed in modest pleasure. Sometimes I'd see him resting near Rosa's chair, and I'd swear he was guarding her laughter. But even peace has its tests. The oven broke in the middle of a Saturday rush. A deep metallic groan followed by the smell of burned wires. The room fell silent, like a church after someone drops the chalice. I stood there, hands dusted in flour, staring at the dead machine that had been the heartbeat of our small universe. For a moment, panic climbed my throat. Then I heard Rosa again. "Bread will always find a way, if the hands are willing." So we baked in the old stone oven at the back, the one she'd sworn was for emergencies and nostalgia. It took forever to heat, but once it caught fire, the scent it gave off was ancient. Wood, smoke, memory. The customers didn't complain, they lingered, telling stories while we waited. When the loaves finally emerged, the crusts sang when you touched them, crisp and golden. A woman took a bite and began to cry. "It tastes like my grandmother's kitchen," she said. That night after closing, I found myself sitting on the curb outside, watching steam drift from the bakery's chimney. The stars had come out shyly, scattered like crumbs. I leaned against Jax and whispered, "We're doing it, buddy. We're keeping her dream alive." He huffed, leaned heavier into me, and that was answer enough. Summer arrived like forgiveness. Slow, warm, impossible to ignore. The smell of baked bread spilled through open windows into the street. We planted herbs in chipped clay pots out front, basil, thyme, rosemary, and people stopped to touch the leaves as if brushing the fur of an old friend. The bakery no longer felt like Rosa's alone. It was everyone's. The homeless man from the corner cleaned tables for a meal and a story. A teenager painted a mural of Rosa and Jax on the wall, her holding a loaf, him holding a world together. One morning, a letter came addressed simply to the Blue Door Bakery. Inside was a note from Maeve, the woman we'd rescued that winter in the crosswalk. Her handwriting was shaky but alive. "You saved my life twice. Once from the snow, and once from the loneliness that came after. Your bread tastes like home." I pressed the letter to my chest. Jack sniffed it, wagging, as if he too recognized the scent of healing. Then autumn crept in, brushing gold onto the maples. The bakery grew busier. A group of veterans started coming every Sunday morning. Men and women like me, carrying invisible wars behind their eyes. We didn't talk about the past much. We talked about dough temperatures, about how coffee helps the hands steady. Jax moved among them like an old sergeant checking morale. For the first time since leaving service, I felt command replaced by community. One evening after closing, I caught sight of my reflection in the bakery window. The soft glow behind me, the ghost of Rosa's picture above the counter, Jack sleeping by the door. I barely recognized the man staring back. Not because he was different, but because he was whole. That night the dream came. I was back in the fire, the smoke curling like ribboned ghosts. Rosa was there, standing by the oven, her face calm, her hands steady. "You were never lost," she said. "You were just waiting for something worth finding." When I woke, dawn had painted the kitchen gold. I took it as a message, keep going. Winter returned, as it always does. The cold tried to slip through the cracks, but the ovens fought back. We started something new that year, a Bread for Souls program. Anyone could pay for an extra loaf, and we'd give it to someone who couldn't afford one. Within weeks, the wall filled with little notes of gratitude. "Thank you for feeding my kids. This saved my night. You remind me of my mother." The city that had once passed me by had begun to speak my name with warmth. Sometimes, When the day ends and I'm sweeping crumbs from under the tables, I imagine Rosa sitting in her chair again, eyes bright with that stubborn humor. "You've done well, soldier," she'd say, "but don't let it make you soft." And I'd laugh, because even in memory she still runs the place.